She waited by the window, counting every second, until the truth finally knocked on her door. Laura didn't expect humiliation to arrive wrapped in silk and champagne, yet there she was in the third row of her younger sister's wedding, smoothing the crease of a rented dress that pinched at the ribs, while her 8-year-old son, Luca, swung his legs beneath the table, proud in a suit she'd paid for across 2 paychecks and a week of overtime at the hotel front desk. He believed the day would stitch their family back together, and she wanted to believe it too. The venue glowed with white roses and gold flatware, the kind of curated elegance her mother, Margot, worshipped like a private religion. And Vivienne, 5 years younger and trained since childhood to move toward light the way sunflowers do, floated through it all with the practiced warmth of a person used to being adored. People said the sisters shared cheekbones. What they didn't share was gravity. Praise orbited Vivienne. Expectations pressed on Laura. She took her seat at table 9, near the restrooms, near the hum of air returns and the staff door swinging on its hinge, and told herself that belonging sometimes starts from the edges. Luca whispered that the chandelier looked like a spaceship, and Laura smiled the kind of smile that comes from wanting a child to remember magic instead of math about money. Through toasts and tinkling laughter, she managed to stay invisible. A skill honed over a decade of working double shifts and learning how to soothe other people's emergencies while swallowing her own. When the groom's best friend finished a harmless, overlong story, and the room dutifully laughed, Vivienne rose with a shimmering hush, her flute held high, her timing immaculate. She thanked the vendors, thanked fate, thanked tradition. Then she turned toward the back, where Laura sat, and said with that bright, gentle pitch that always disguised edges, that she wanted to honor her brave, big sister, a woman who proved you can raise a child without anyone. And the chuckle that followed wasn't cruel yet, but Laura felt it as a draft under a door that wouldn't stay closed. Luca glanced at her, the smile slipping, and Margot, their mother, leaned just enough toward her table mates that her stage whisper could travel, remarking that Laura was pre-loved but polished. And this time the laughter wasn't a draft, it was a slice. Laura's fingers tightened around the napkin until the fabric thinged under her nails. She kept her face still because that was the first survival rule. Don't feed a room that's hungry for your reaction. Vivienne's grin never faltered. Applause dotted the silence, phones flashed, forks chimed, and in that bright unkindness, Laura remembered being 25 and pregnant and promised the moon by a man who left before the 5th month. Remembered how silence had been the family's chosen response, how Margot had turned their living room into a museum, where Laura and her unborn child were an exhibit labeled Consequence. Now the exhibit had been updated and given better lighting. Luca tugged her sleeve and whispered, "Why do they laugh at you, Mom?" And Laura's pulse stumbled because she could hold her own shame. She'd practiced for years, but she had no pockets deep enough to hide his confusion. She stood because her body knew to stand before her mind did, her chair scraping, breath thin, the single aim to reach the hallway where the exit light glowed green, but another chair scraped first at the head table, and Callan Reeves, the groom with the careful smile and unrumpled tux, the man Laura had met twice and filed under gracious, rose without ceremony and took the microphone from Vivienne as if he were moving a glass out of a child's reach. The band leader's hand hovered over the volume faders. Servers froze. The room flexed towards silence. Callan didn't look at Vivienne, and he didn't bother with the softening jokes men sometimes deployed to stitch a tear in the evening. He looked at Laura, and whatever lived on his face, anger or grief or the hard clarity of a man who had watched something he loved get belittled once before, made the room tilt. "Laura," he said, not amplified, yet somehow audible, "please, don't go." The words pinned dozens of gazes to the back of the room. Someone coughed, someone's bracelet clinked against a glass. Margot's mouth formed a warning that didn't travel. Callan lifted the mic, his voice low and steady, and said he wouldn't pretend that what had just happened was a joke or tradition. He wouldn't marry into a ceremony that baptized cruelty as family. Vivienne, up close, still held the posture of a woman posing for a magazine, but her eyes flicked toward Margot the way a student glances at a teacher after giving the wrong answer. Laura, who had long ago learned to interpret rooms the way sailors read weather, noticed it, the small shift called consequence. And for the first time that evening, she felt something other than heat in her cheeks. Distance, as if she had stepped a pace away from the stage everyone expected her to play on. Callan spoke of loyalty and kindness as if they were rules printed on an invitation and not optional decorations. He said the quiet part too loud for anyone to ignore, that mocking a single mother in front of her child wasn't wit, it was rot, and rooms built on rot always fall. A fork fell somewhere near the bar, an aunt's hand paused over a clutch, the string lights hummed like possibility. Callan set the microphone down. No flourish, no drama, and walked past Vivian's bouquet and Margot's stare and the coordinator's frozen smile towards the doors. In the heartbeat before the music could pretend nothing had happened, Laura reached for Luca's hand. They moved together, not rushed. People parted instinctively, the way they move for emergency lights. Only this was the opposite of emergency. This was a refusal. Grandfather Norman, who used to call Laura a lion when she climbed a fence at 7 to rescue a stray, rose trembling and whispered an apology that felt like an overdue bill paid in coins, and Laura nodded because she didn't have the space to carry anyone else's debt tonight. Outside, night air found their lungs like water. In the parking lot glow, Luca asked if the wedding was over, and Laura, who had never taught him the word catharsis, told him yes. She drove home without the radio, the road's steady hush painting over the sharpness. In the morning, there would be calls and clips and the strange efficiency of the internet when it chooses a side. There would be a bouquet with a card that said, "To the Lioness," in neat, unfamiliar script. There would be silence from Vivienne and a single brittle phone call from Margot later, claiming Laura had embarrassed the family by refusing to laugh. But tonight, there was only the hum of the fridge, Luca's soft breathing, and the unnamed relief of a woman who had finally watched a room run out of permission to make her small. And somewhere in that relief, as she lay awake listening to a city that never learned to whisper, a different memory stepped forward. The day, years ago, when Laura brought home a second-hand bike, and Luca, wobbling but brave, kept falling and getting up, and how she told him that balance isn't a gift, it's a decision you renew every second you're moving. She realized the same was true of dignity. You don't wait for anyone to hand it back, you decide not to set it down again. By morning, the video had learned to sprint. Someone at table 4 had captured Callan's steady voice and Laura's stillness, and the clip leapt from a cousin's timeline to strangers' feeds with the tireless energy of outrage seeking its counterweight. And comments began to stack like sandbags around Laura's name. Praise for courage she hadn't performed, gratitude from single parents who recognized the particular ache of being turned into a lesson, and a chorus of people asking the same question: who teaches a room to laugh at the wrong person? Laura didn't dive into the comments. She scrolled the way you touch a bruise to check if it's healing, not to reopen it. And then she put the phone face down and made Luca pancakes, because ritual is the spine of a safe morning. At school drop-off, he squeezed her hand longer than usual and asked if people on the internet could see their apartment. She said no and watched his shoulders loosen, another small mercy. At the cafe, regulars who once ordered with perfunctory smiles now tipped generously, overcompensating perhaps, but kindness is still kindness. A woman in a navy blazer said her sister raised 2 kids alone, and that the speech in the video felt like someone finally closing a door that had been left open to the cold. Mid-shift, Laura's phone lit with an unknown number. She nearly ignored it, but something in her chest, a tug between caution and curiosity, pushed her to pick up. "Laura?" the voice asked, careful, familiar in its restraint. "Callan." She hadn't expected to hear from him, and certainly not so soon, yet here he was, speaking as if stepping softly across a floor with sleeping children. He apologized first, not in a performative way that seeks applause, but as a person aware that his public act had dragged them all into a wider theater. He said he'd left the venue and driven around for an hour, past the river and the old train depot, avoiding home because home was now a complicated word. He admitted he hadn't planned the speech, that it lived under his ribs for years and needed only the smallest spark to catch. When he said this, Laura heard what he wasn't saying: a story. People who speak like that have a room in their past where a similar thing happened and no one stood. She didn't ask. He didn't offer. Boundaries, even between near strangers, can be a kind of care. He thanked her for leaving with dignity, said he'd send the bouquet, which she would later find flat on the doormat, and asked if Luca was okay. She answered yes, which was mostly true, and they let the silence be an arrangement instead of a problem until a line at the counter forced her to end the call. By late afternoon, Margot's voice arrived as a voicemail shaped like a sermon. Laura had humiliated the family by refusing to play along. Vivian was distraught. The caterer wanted to know if he should expect payment from the bride or the party responsible for the disruption, and the phrase responsibility slid around Margot's mouth the way people hold knives when their hands are tired, but their intent is not. Laura listened once, felt the old heat rise, and then did something new. She deleted it without rehearsing a reply in her head. At the hotel desk that night, a man in a faded baseball cap checked in, and after fumbling with his card, looked up and said his sister had raised him after their dad left, that he didn't know how to thank her for all the invisible nights she held a family together, and that he'd seen a video that helped him text her without sounding like a stranger. Laura printed his key card and decided that sometimes the world gives you back a thimble of sweetness for every gallon it took. When she came home, a brown envelope waited with no return address. Inside, a plain page printout of a headline: "Wedding speech goes viral, groom calls out bride for mocking single mom," and beneath it, in blue pen, "You don't owe anyone a performance." No signature. The handwriting wasn't Callan's. His note had been the simple "To the Lioness." She taped this page inside a kitchen cabinet where only she and Luca would see it. Meanwhile, Margot curated the mess like she curated everything. She deleted the wedding photos that had been posted before the speech, uploaded an old picture of herself with a caption about resilience, and typed a longer message explaining that humor had been taken out of context, that modern audiences love to be offended, all while her closest friends texted privately to ask if the engagement was salvageable. It wasn't. Callan's parents, both quiet, both unaccustomed to public drama, had called him not to demand an explanation, but to offer dinner and a soft place to land. A brother-in-law left a voicemail that contained only the sound of breathing and one sentence: "You did the right thing." In the quiet after that chorus, Callan finally picked up his own past. Years before, when he was 19, his older sister Mara had brought home a baby and a silence. The baby's father had evaporated into the excuses men fit into the shape of their absence, and their parents, good but frightened by the shape of a future they hadn't rehearsed, tried to fold Mara back into acceptability with phrases like phase and later. At a Christmas party, an uncle couched cruelty as concern, asking who would want someone else's chapter half written, and the laugh that skittered around the room settled on Mara's shoulders. Callan remembered standing there with his mouth full of nothing useful to say, remembered the way Mara's eyes hardened into a mirror in which everyone else could see themselves if they dared to look. Years later, a late-night fever took that baby-turned-teenager in a sudden, cruel way a body sometimes fails. Grief remade the family in a shape that allowed fewer jokes, but the sound of that uncle's laugh never left the room where Callan stored his regrets. He had promised himself, privately, pointlessly, that the next time a room rotated its cruelty toward a woman who had chosen to carry more than her share, he would not be 19 and wordless. This history, when he finally shared it, would matter to Laura, but not yet. For now, it was only the gravity behind his decision, the unseen hinge that made his speech swing open. The internet's appetite moved quickly, as appetites do. By day 3, a new scandal shoved theirs down the feed, but the residue remained. Laura's phone would buzz occasionally with messages that felt like postcards from strangers' kitchen tables, people thanking her for existing in a way that reminded them of their own mother or sister or friend. She created a small rule for herself. Reply to 3 a day with sincerity and let the rest be good noise. She also made a larger rule, the kind you write only inside your bones. No more rooms where laughter requires self-erasure. And then, because rules turn hollow without action, she took a step she'd been avoiding for years. She walked into the school office and asked about volunteering for the library hour on Tuesdays, something she'd always wanted to do, but convinced herself she was too busy or too embarrassed to try. The secretary smiled with relief, said they needed hands, especially hands that knew what it meant to keep promises. That night, when Luca built a speech for his action figures about standing up for the little guy, Laura sat on the carpet and asked what the little guy would do when the room didn't listen. He answered without looking up. He'd say it louder until the right person heard. She thought of Callan, of Norman's trembling apology, of the barista who set her coffee down every morning, now without comment, but with a gentler clink, and realized that sometimes the right person is the future watching you now. 2 weeks later, with the noise mostly subsided, a carefully worded email from a local radio producer arrived asking if Laura would share her perspective on dignity and family on a morning segment. Old Laura would have declined out of muscle memory, but the version slowly assembling herself decided that telling the truth on her own terms was not performance, it was stewardship. She typed a yes with conditions. No names, no direct identifiers, no appetite for turning pain into content. And when she pressed send, she felt the peculiar calm that often follows deciding not to hide. Across town, in a small apartment that still smelled faintly of the florist shop where the bouquet had been assembled, Callan drafted a letter he never intended to send to Vivian, not to apologize, not to negotiate, but to name the thing plainly so he would not forget who he had been in that room. He wrote that he wanted to be the kind of man who didn't confuse applause with virtue, ceremony with love, tradition with permission to be unkind. He folded the letter and slid it between pages of a book his sister had loved. In the space between these private acts, Laura volunteering on Tuesdays, Callan writing a letter to a future self, something like a story began to grow that wasn't about a wedding at all. It was about how two people, unaligned by fate or plan, had chosen the same posture at the same time. Don't let the room decide what matters. The radio station sat above a bakery that opened before dawn, so the hallway smelled of sugar and heat when Laura arrived that Tuesday, hands folded around a paper cup of coffee that had gone cold by the time the elevator door closed. She had promised herself to speak plainly, not heroically. The producer, a kind-eyed woman named Sonia, guided her into a booth where the walls were covered in gray foam and mercy. She adjusted the headphones and said they'd keep it conversational, just share what she felt comfortable sharing. Laura nodded, her palms damp, her heart keeping a rhythm she hadn't approved. When the red light blinked on, the host, a gentle man with a voice like warm gravel, introduced her as the woman from the video who reminded us what dignity looks like. The phrase felt too large for her shoulders, but she let it sit there for a moment. He asked about that night, about what went through her mind when laughter turned sharp. Laura told the truth. She had wanted to disappear, but her son had been watching, and she realized that sometimes the only power left is the refusal to leave as a ghost. The host asked if she forgave her family. She paused before answering. Forgiveness, she said, isn't a door you open for them, it's a window you open for yourself so you don't suffocate. When the interview ended, Sonia removed her headset and whispered, "Thank you for sounding human." Laura walked outside into the sunlight that felt almost too bright. And for the first time since the wedding, she didn't feel like she was being watched. She felt like she was being witnessed. 2 blocks away, at a cafe window, Callan listened to the broadcast replay through earbuds, the same way he used to listen to his sister Mara's old voicemails when the house got too quiet. He hadn't told anyone about Mara yet, not even Laura, but the sound of her composure on the air triggered an echo. The last time he'd seen Mara alive, she had been laughing on a park bench, her son climbing on the slide, and she had said, "People think single means empty, but it just means you've stopped renting yourself out to loneliness." That line had haunted him, not because it was sad, but because it was whole. After the broadcast, messages flooded the station, listeners thanking Laura for saying what they couldn't, some asking to connect, some sharing their own stories of being the family's silent shame. Sonia forwarded a few, including one from a community group that helped single parents access grants and education. Laura read it twice, not ready to hope, but curious. The next day, Margot showed up at the cafe. She never visited, and the sight of her amid the smell of espresso and bleach felt surreal, like a photograph that shouldn't exist. She ordered tea, sat at the counter, and without preamble said, "You've embarrassed us enough. Take down the interview. People are talking." Laura leaned against the counter, towel in hand, and asked quietly, "What exactly are they saying, Mom? That I told the truth?" Margot's face pinched. She insisted it was never about truth. It was about family image, the invisible fabric she'd spent decades maintaining. Laura realized then that Margot didn't fear disgrace. She feared exposure to a world where performance no longer counted as love. She told her mother that she wasn't taking anything down and that she no longer owed silence to anyone's comfort. Margot stood, her mouth trembling, but her posture still rehearsed, and said, "Don't come cry to me when you're alone." Laura smiled softly and said, "I've been alone before, but at least now it's honest." Margot left, her heels clicking like punctuation marks of a language Laura had finally stopped speaking. That night, Callan called again. He asked if she'd heard the interview. She laughed and said she lived it. He admitted he had listened twice, said her words reminded him of someone he'd lost. That's when he finally told her about Mara, how the world had punished her for doing something beautiful alone, how he'd stayed quiet out of fear of making it worse, and how silence had become his greatest regret. Laura listened without interruption, the way people do when they recognize the shape of another's pain. When he finished, she said, "Maybe you didn't fail her. Maybe you just saved the next person instead." They didn't call it friendship, but it was something with more oxygen than most conversations either of them had known. Days turned into weeks, life rearranged itself around new rhythms. Luca's school project on family heroes featured Callan's quote about kindness and strength. The teacher wrote a note saying his presentation made half the class cry. Laura laughed when she read it, but that laugh didn't sting anymore. In the background, Vivian's life had shrunk to whispers. Some friends distanced themselves, unwilling to stand beside the fallout. She started attending charity events, posing for photos that tried to rewrite her as misunderstood. But the internet forgets unevenly. Every time her name resurfaced, someone reshared the video, calling it the speech that stopped the room. Late one evening, Vivian texted Laura for the first time in months. "We should talk." Laura stared at the message, thumb hovering, heart heavy with the weight of possibility. Luca was asleep, the apartment quiet. She typed one word, "When," and then erased it. Instead, she wrote, "I'm listening." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a door cracked open to air out a decade of rot. On the other side of the city, Callan sat by his window, phone in hand, drafting a message he'd never send. "Thank you for being the person who reminded me to keep promises I made to ghosts." He saved it in drafts, exhaled, and looked up at the same moon Laura could see from her balcony, the kind that makes you believe maybe some stories don't end, they just find quieter rooms to live in. Vivian suggested they meet at a neutral place, a greenhouse cafe on the edge of town, where everything smelled like mint and damp soil, where strangers came to hide behind ferns and talk about things they didn't want overheard. Laura arrived first, early as always, choosing a table near the back where sunlight filtered through wide glass panels. She didn't know what she expected. Apology, confrontation, maybe both. But her stomach twisted the same way it used to before school recitals, when she'd stand behind her perfect little sister, watching her shine. Vivian arrived 10 minutes late, dressed in effortless beige, sunglasses still on despite the filtered light. She sat, removed them slowly, and for the first time in months, Laura saw something unfamiliar in her sister's face. Hesitation. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Vivian inhaled sharply and said, "You've ruined my life." The words landed like cold water. Laura blinked, steadying herself, then asked, "How?" Vivian's voice trembled, part anger, part defense. She said the video destroyed her reputation, that clients backed out of deals, that even her friends didn't know what to say. You didn't have to stay silent. You could have said something to calm him down. Laura stared at her, feeling the familiar old script trying to pull her back into the role of scapegoat. But something inside her had changed. You humiliated me in front of my son, and I was supposed to save your image? Vivian's mouth opened, then closed again. The silence stretched until the sound of the espresso machine filled it. Laura leaned forward. You didn't lose your life, Viv. You lost control of the story. There's a difference. That was when Vivian's eyes flickered. Hurt, confusion, maybe realization. You think you're better than me now, she whispered. No, Laura said. I just stopped letting you define me. For a few minutes, neither spoke. Then Vivian's facade cracked in a way Laura had never seen. Her fingers trembled as she stirred a cup she hadn't touched. You have no idea, she said finally, her voice smaller now. Do you think it was easy being the favorite? Mom never let me fail. Every mistake I made, she covered it up. But she never let me be real either. I couldn't even pick the man I loved without her approval. Laura froze. It wasn't an excuse, but it was a glimpse, an outline of the cage that looked like privilege from the outside. So why mock me, she asked. Vivian looked down at her hands. Because she told me that's how you control a room. You laugh first, so no one laughs at you. The sentence landed heavy and true. For the first time, Laura saw the mirror, the way pain had been passed down like an heirloom. And Callan, Laura asked quietly, did you love him? Her lips parted, then pressed together. I did, she said, barely audible, but I didn't know how to love someone who saw through me. Laura's throat tightened. There was no satisfaction in hearing it, no triumph, only the quiet ache of understanding something too late to change. Outside the window, rain began to fall softly against the glass, blurring the world into watercolor. Vivian looked up and whispered, I don't know how to fix this. Laura thought of Luca, of the look on his face that night, of Callan's voice steady and calm, of her own silence cracking open like a seed. You start by not pretending it didn't happen. You stop calling cruelty tradition. You start there. They sat in silence until the rain slowed. When they finally stood, Vivian reached for her coat, hesitated, then said, Tell Luca I'm sorry. Laura nodded. Tell him yourself someday. And then she walked away, not as the older sister who always stayed behind to clean up, but as a woman finally done carrying stories that weren't hers. That night, Luca found her sitting on the balcony, the air cool, the city soft with evening. Was Aunt Viv nice today? He asked. Laura smiled faintly. She was honest, she said. He frowned. Is that good? It's a start, she answered. He climbed onto her lap, resting his head on her shoulder. You know what? He whispered. You don't look small anymore. She laughed quietly, a sound that trembled between tears and relief. Somewhere far away, in an apartment lined with unopened gifts and silence, Vivian replayed that conversation and stared at her reflection, realizing for the first time that power built on cruelty collapses quietly, like glass under its own weight. Weeks passed quietly, the kind of quiet that doesn't feel empty, but earned. Laura returned to her routines, school mornings, coffee shifts, library days, and the world that had once felt too heavy now fit her shoulders better. The air around her carried less apology. One evening, after closing the cafe, she stepped out into the cool dusk and found Callan waiting across the street, leaning against his car, hands in his pockets like a man rehearsing something. She hesitated, then crossed. You're a hard person to find, he said softly. Not really, she smiled, just not in the same rooms as before. He laughed quietly, the sound low and unsure. I heard about the interview. You were brilliant. Laura shook her head. I was honest, that's all. They stood there for a moment, the city noise folding around them. Finally, he said, "I wanted to tell you in person. I reached out to Vivian." Laura's stomach tightened. Why? Because endings shouldn't rot. We talked. She's figuring things out. I don't think she knows who she is without a mirror, but maybe that's good. Maybe now she'll find her own reflection. Laura nodded slowly. She said she was sorry, Kellen added. Not enough, but real. A pause lingered between them. Then he said, "And I wanted to say thank you." For what? For reminding me that standing up doesn't mean you have to shout. Sometimes you just have to stay. He looked at her, eyes tired but kind. "Mara would have liked you." The name caught Laura by surprise. "Your sister?" He nodded. "She used to say, dignity isn't what you wear, it's what you walk away with." Laura smiled, her throat tight. "She sounds like someone I wish I'd met." She'd say, "You just did." They didn't talk much after that. Just walked a few blocks together, quiet as two people who understood the language of survival. When they reached her car, he stopped. "Take care of yourself, Laura." "You too," she replied. He hesitated, then added, "You ever need someone to remind you that you're more than what they made you, call me." He handed her a small card. Not romantic, just simple. Reeves Construction. Callan. She smiled. "You still believe in fixing things?" "Only what deserves to stand," he said. And then he left. That night, Laura tucked the card into a drawer and didn't look at it again. Not out of disinterest, but because peace isn't built on rescue. Still, sometimes she'd catch herself smiling for no reason, the way people do when the world suddenly feels wider. Meanwhile, Vivian began showing up at her mother's house unannounced, wearing no makeup, her tone quieter. Margot didn't know what to do with a daughter who wasn't performing, who spoke in honest sentences instead of polished ones. "You look tired," Margot said. "Maybe," Vivian answered, "but for the first time, it's my face I see in the mirror." That unnerved Margot. That kind of truth. She changed the subject to table settings and gossip, but something in her voice trembled, the beginning of doubt. When Vivian left, she walked through the park where children played, sat on a bench, and watched a single mother lift her toddler after a fall. There was no audience, no applause, just tenderness. She realized that love could exist without witnesses, and for the first time, cried without shame. Days later, Vivian texted Laura again. "I don't expect forgiveness, just wanted you to know I'm trying." Laura read it and felt something loosen inside her chest. She didn't reply right away. Instead, she closed her phone and sat beside Luca, who was drawing superheroes at the table. "Who's that?" she asked, pointing. "This one's you," he said proudly. "Your power's invisible shields." "To protect others?" she asked. "No," he grinned. "To protect yourself this time." She laughed softly, realizing that somewhere between humiliation and healing, her son had learned what she'd spent years trying to understand, that strength isn't about endurance, it's about permission to stop bleeding for people who never offered a bandage. Later that night, Laura finally replied to Vivian, "Keep trying. It's the only way any of us ever change." And with that, something old inside her finally rested. Autumn arrived quietly that year, turning the city gold around the edges. Laura noticed it one morning while walking Luca to school, the way the air carried that thin chill that made people draw closer, the way sunlight looked softer on old brick. Life had settled into something that felt almost like rhythm. She worked, cooked, read before bed, and no longer waited for the next storm. Even silence, once heavy, had become a kind of music. One Saturday, while rearranging old boxes in the closet, she found a framed photograph from her childhood. Margot smiling tightly between her two daughters, one hand resting on Vivian's shoulder, the other awkwardly on Laura's arm, as if affection were a prop she hadn't rehearsed. Laura studied it for a long time before setting it aside. That same afternoon, a letter arrived in her mailbox. The handwriting was familiar, elegant, controlled. It was from her mother. Inside, a single sheet. I don't know how to speak the way you do. I was raised to survive reputation, not truth. You broke something I thought was sacred, but maybe it needed breaking. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I hope you'll visit before the house forgets your footsteps. Laura read it 3 times. Her first instinct was caution, then curiosity. She waited a full week before deciding. On Sunday, she and Luca took a bus across town to the house she'd once called home. The garden was overgrown, ivy crawling across the fence, the paint fading at the edges. Margot opened the door slowly, thinner than before, her once perfect hair now silver and soft. For a second, both women froze, unsure whether to reach out or retreat. Luca broke the tension, handing Margot a small paper bag. "We brought apple pie," he said cheerfully. Margot smiled faintly, her eyes glistening. "You've grown," she whispered. Inside, the house smelled the same. Lavender polish, old wood, the faint ghost of cigarettes. They sat in the living room where so many arguments had begun. But this time there was no sharpness, only the echo of what used to be. Margot poured tea, her hands trembling slightly. "I saw the interview," she said. "You looked free." Laura nodded, unsure what to say. "I didn't understand you before," Margot continued, staring at her cup. "I thought strength meant pretending, but you made me realize I was just tired of pretending." Laura looked at her mother's face, lined not with vanity, but with years she had spent guarding an image that never truly existed. "You did what you knew," Laura said quietly. "So did I." Margot met her eyes. "Can we try again?" The question wasn't dramatic, it was fragile, offered like something that might shatter if spoken too loud. Laura hesitated, then reached across the table, covering her mother's hand with her own. "We can try," she said. That was all. No grand reconciliation, no tears that fixed everything, just a choice to stop wounding each other. When they left, Luca hugged his grandmother tightly. "You should come see my school sometime," he said. Margot smiled through tears. "I'd like that." As they walked back to the bus stop, leaves swirled around their feet, and Laura felt something she hadn't felt in years, a clean kind of peace, like breathing after holding your breath for too long. That evening, she called Callan. "It's done," she said simply. "What is?" he asked. "The waiting," she answered. He understood. They talked until the sky went dark. After hanging up, Laura stepped onto her balcony. The city hummed softly below, and she realized she no longer needed to look backward for closure. She had already carried it forward. Inside, Luca was drawing again, this time a family of 3, standing under a tree, no labels, no symbols, just hands held together. "Is that us?" she asked. He nodded. "And Grandma?" He grinned. "She's learning." Laura laughed quietly, closing her eyes against the night breeze. Life hadn't given her perfection, but it had given her truth. And truth, she realized, could be its own kind of love. Months later, winter returned, quiet and pale, and Laura found herself walking through the same park where she once used to sit and dream of escape. Only now, she didn't need to escape anything. The air was sharp, but her chest was steady. Luca ran ahead, his laughter echoing off the frozen pond, and she thought how strange it was that the same world that once humiliated her could now feel safe again, not because it had changed, but because she finally had. Every scar she'd carried, every cruel word, every silence that once buried her voice, had turned into something she could stand on instead of sink beneath. She had learned that forgiveness wasn't surrender, it was release, a way of setting herself free from the story her family had written for her. Vivian visited sometimes now, awkward, but trying. She brought cookies, asked about Luca's grades, and stayed for tea. They didn't talk about the wedding anymore. They didn't need to. The apology had already lived in their actions. Margot came too, once a week, slower now, quieter, often just sitting on the balcony watching the sunset with her grandson. One evening, she said, almost to herself, "I thought respect came from fear. You showed me it comes from love." Laura didn't answer. Some truths don't need replies. She looked at her mother's lined face, softened by time, and realized that even broken people can learn new languages if someone stops shouting long enough to listen. Later, that night, after everyone had gone home, Laura opened her laptop to an email from the radio producer, Sonia. It was short. "Your story keeps finding people. They're calling it the wedding that changed the internet." Laura smiled, then closed the laptop. Fame had never mattered. Peace did. She walked to the window, watching the city lights flicker like tiny promises in the dark. Somewhere across town, Callan was building a new home for his parents, a project that, he said, reminded him of beginnings rather than endings. They still spoke sometimes, not as saviors or broken halves, but as two people who had survived their own silences and learned to speak with grace. In one of his messages, he wrote, "You taught me that love isn't always about staying, it's about standing." And she knew what he meant. The night deepened. Lucas slept in his room, a superhero blanket pulled up to his chin. Laura stood by his door for a long while, the same way she had after the wedding. But this time, there was no ache in her chest, just gratitude. She whispered, "We made it, baby." And for once, she didn't mean survival. She meant something quieter, stronger, the kind of peace that stays. The next morning, she woke early, made pancakes, and watched Lucas at the table. Outside, the city began to glow with the first light of dawn. Somewhere, maybe a stranger still replayed the video of that day, still found courage in a man's voice saying, "This isn't family." But Laura knew now that real family wasn't about blood or names. It was about presence, compassion, and the courage to stop pretending. She smiled, looking out at the sunrise, whispering words that belonged not to the internet, but to herself. Being alone never meant being unloved. It meant I was finally free enough to be whole. And if you've ever been laughed at, silenced, or made to feel small for standing your ground, remember her. Remember that strength isn't loud. Sometimes it's just a woman refusing to look down while the world expects her to. Because dignity, once reclaimed, is the kind of crown no one can take you from you again.